I never thought my life would shatter over a conversation I wasn't supposed to hear. You know that feeling when you walk into your own home, your sanctuary, and everything feels right. The familiar scent of vanilla candles, the soft hum of the refrigerator, the warmth that wraps around you like a blanket. That's what I felt that Tuesday evening. I had just finished a long shift at the hospital where I worked as a pediatric nurse. My feet ached, my scrubs smelled faintly of antiseptic, and all I wanted was to collapse on the couch with a cup of chamomile tea. My name is Claire, and for 8 years I believed I had built the perfect life. My husband Daniel was everything I thought I needed: handsome, successful, charming in a way that made strangers trust him instantly. He was a financial advisor with his own growing firm, always dressed in tailored suits that made him look like he stepped out of a magazine. We had a beautiful home in the suburbs, a golden retriever named Max, and plans to start a family soon. Everyone called us the ideal couple. My mother adored him. My friends envied what we had. I envied what we had. But that evening, as I pushed open the front door with my shoulder, balancing my purse and a bag of groceries, something felt different. The house was too quiet. Usually, Daniel would greet me with a kiss on the forehead or call out from his home, but this time there was nothing, just an eerie silence that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I set the groceries on the kitchen counter and listened. That's when I heard it. His voice, low and careful, coming from the study upstairs. I wasn't the type to eavesdrop. I trusted Daniel completely, but something in his tone, that guarded quality, made me pause. I kicked off my shoes and moved toward the staircase, each step deliberate and silent. The wooden floor didn't creak beneath my feet. I could hear him more clearly now, speaking in hushed tones, words I couldn't quite make out but that carried a weight I'd never heard before. My heart started beating faster, not from suspicion, but from confusion. Who was he talking to at this hour? Why did he sound so secretive? I reached the top of the stairs and positioned myself just outside the study door, which was slightly ajar. The light from his desk lamp cast shadows that danced across the hallway wall, and then I heard the words that would change everything. Daniel's voice, clear and cold, saying something I never imagined possible. "I'm done pretending. The money's almost transferred. Once it's clean, I'm out." She has no idea. My breath caught in my throat. My mind scrambled to make sense of what I'd just heard. Who was he talking about? What money? Out of what? And then, like a puzzle piece snapping into place, the horrifying realization hit me. He was talking about me. I was the she who had no idea. I pressed my hand against the wall to steady myself, my legs suddenly weak. I wanted to burst through that door, demand answers, scream at him to explain himself. But something stopped me. Some instinct for self-preservation whispered that I needed to hear more, understand the full scope of whatever betrayal was unfolding. Daniel continued, his voice laced with a confidence that made my stomach turn. "The accounts are set up offshore. She doesn't look at the statements anymore. Trust me completely, it's almost too easy. I'll file for divorce once everything's secure. By the time she realizes what's happened, I'll be untouchable." There was a pause, presumably the other person responding, and then Daniel laughed, a short, bitter sound that I'd never heard from him before. "Love, come on, that was never part of the plan. She served her purpose, good credit, stable income. Made me look legitimate to investors. But I'm past that now. I felt like I was watching my life from outside my body. This couldn't be real. This couldn't be the man I'd shared a bed with for 8 years, the man I'd planned a future with, the man who'd held me through my father's funeral and promised we'd face everything together. But it was. Every word from his mouth was like a dagger, precise and calculated, designed to destroy everything I thought I knew. I stood there in that hallway, my back against the wall, tears streaming down my face without me even realizing I was crying. My hands were shaking. My entire world was collapsing, and he had no idea I was hearing every single word. Daniel spoke again, this time with an edge of impatience. "Look, I've got to go. She'll be home soon. Just make sure the final transfer goes through by Friday. After that, I'm done with this charade." Yeah, I'll handle it. She won't suspect a thing." The call ended, and I heard the soft thud of his phone hitting the desk. I needed to move, to get away from that door before he came out and found me standing there. But my feet wouldn't cooperate. I was frozen, trapped in a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. Somehow, I managed to force myself back down the stairs, moving on autopilot. My mind was racing, thoughts colliding and fragmenting. How long had he been planning this? What money was he talking about? Had he been stealing from me, from our accounts, from everything we'd built together? And who was on the other end of that call? A lawyer, an accomplice, a partner in whatever scheme he was running? I stumbled into the kitchen, gripping the edge of the counter to keep from falling. Max came padding over, his tail wagging, completely oblivious to the fact that his world was about to change too. I knelt down and buried my face in his fur, trying to muffle the sobs that were threatening to tear out of my chest. I don't know how long I stayed like that, crouched on the kitchen floor with my dog, the only loyal presence in a house built on lies. But eventually, I heard Daniel's footsteps on the stairs. I forced myself to stand, wiped my face with the back of my hand, and took a deep breath. I couldn't let him know that I knew, not yet. If he saw any hint of awareness in my eyes, he'd accelerate whatever plan he had in motion. I needed time. Time to think, time to plan, time to figure out how to survive what was coming. So when he walked into the kitchen with that familiar smile, the one that used to make my heart flutter, I smiled back. And in that moment, I became someone I'd never been before. I became a woman preparing for war. That night was the longest of my life. Daniel acted completely normal, as if he hadn't just been plotting my financial and emotional destruction upstairs. He asked about my day at the hospital, complained about a difficult client, suggested we order Thai food for dinner. I played along, my responses automatic, my face a mask I'd never had to wear before. Inside, and I was screaming. Every time he touched my hand across the dinner table, I wanted to pull away. Every time he smiled at me, I saw the lie beneath it. But I held steady. I had to. After dinner, we watched a movie on the couch, his arm draped casually over my shoulders. I couldn't tell you what we watched. My mind was somewhere else entirely, replaying every moment of our relationship, searching for clues I'd missed. Had there been signs, red flags I'd been too trusting to notice? I thought back to the past few months. Daniel had been working longer hours, taking calls in private, being vague about certain business dealings. At the time, I'd attributed it to the pressures of growing his firm. Now, still, every innocent explanation twisted into something sinister. When we finally went to bed, Daniel fell asleep almost immediately, his breathing deep and even. I lay next to him, staring at the ceiling in the darkness, my heart pounding so hard I was sure he could hear it. This man, this stranger wearing my husband's face, had been planning to abandon me, to rob me, to discard me like I meant nothing. And he'd done it all while kissing me goodnight, while telling me he loved me, while making plans for our future that he never intended to see through. The betrayal was so complete, so thorough, that I almost couldn't process it. But as the hours ticked by and dawn began to creep through the curtains, something shifted inside me. The shock and grief began to harden into something else. Anger, not the hot, this explosive kind that makes you do reckless things. No, this was cold and calculating, a fury that sharpened my mind instead of clouding it. If Daniel thought I was going to be a passive victim in his scheme, he was about to learn how wrong he was. I'd spent my entire adult life taking care of others, putting their needs before my own, being the reliable, trustworthy Claire who never made waves. That version of me had just been destroyed. What emerged in her place was someone I didn't quite recognize yet, but someone I was eager to meet. The next morning, I called in sick to work. I had never called in sick. I was the nurse who showed up with a fever, who covered extra shifts, who prided herself on reliability. But that morning, I needed time. I needed space to think without Daniel watching me, without having to maintain the pretense. He left for the office at his usual time, kissing my forehead and telling me to rest. The moment his car pulled out of the driveway, I sprang into action. First, I needed information. I needed to understand exactly what he'd done, what he was planning, and how deep this betrayal ran. I started with his study, the room where I'd overheard that fateful conversation. Daniel wasn't particularly careful about hiding things because he'd never had reason to suspect I'd go looking. His laptop was password protected, but I knew his passwords. He used the same few variations for everything, combinations of his mother's maiden name and his birthday. It took me 3 tries, and then I was in. What I found made my blood run cold. Email exchanges with someone named Marcus, discussions about transferring assets, setting up offshore accounts. liquidating investments. There were spreadsheets tracking our joint finances, notes about how to move money without triggering alerts, timelines for when he planned to initiate divorce proceedings. But it got worse, much worse. I found a folder labeled New Life, and inside were details that shattered what little remained of my composure. Plans for a condo in the Cayman Islands, flight bookings for 2 people, and photos. Photos of Daniel with a woman I'd never seen before. She was younger than me, blonde, beautiful in that effortless way that makes other women feel inadequate. They were on a beach somewhere tropical, his arm around her waist, both of them laughing like they didn't have a care in the world. The timestamp on the photos was from 2 months ago during a business trip Daniel had taken. Or what he'd told me was a business trip. I sat back in his chair staring at the screen, my hands trembling. This wasn't just about money, he'd found someone else. Someone he was planning a future with while systematically dismantling the life he'd built with me. Every investment we'd made together, every dollar I'd contributed from my nursing salary, every sacrifice I'd made to support his business ventures, all of it was being siphoned away to fund his escape with her. I felt sick, physically, violently sick. I barely made it to the bathroom before I threw up, my body rejecting the reality I was being forced to accept. But I couldn't afford to fall apart. Not yet. I splashed cold water on my face and looked at myself in the mirror. My eyes were red and swollen, my skin pale, but beneath the devastation, I saw something else. Determination. I went back to the study and started taking screenshots of everything, every email, every document, every photo. I sent them to a private email account I created on the spot, one Daniel would never think to look for. Then I dug deeper, looking into our financial accounts online. What I discovered was even more alarming than I'd anticipated. Daniel had already transferred significant amounts of money out of our joint accounts. He'd been doing it gradually over the past 6 months, small enough amounts that I hadn't noticed when I occasionally glanced at statements, but substantial when you added them all together. Nearly $200,000 was gone, money from the sale of investment properties we'd owned together, money from his business accounts that my good credit had helped him secure loans for, money from savings we'd built for our future children. It was all disappearing into accounts I had no access to, accounts set up in jurisdictions where recovering funds would be nearly impossible. I felt like I was standing on the edge of a cliff, looking down at the ruins of everything I'd believed in. But I didn't jump. Instead, I stepped back, took a breath, and started making my own plans. If Daniel thought he could outsmart me, outmaneuver me, leave me with nothing while he sailed off into the sunset with his mistress and my money, he was gravely mistaken. I was a trauma nurse. I'd spent years dealing with emergencies and staying calm under pressure, making life or death decisions in split seconds. This was just another kind of emergency, and I was very good at my job. I spent the rest of the day gathering evidence, documenting everything I could find. I made copies of tax returns, bank statements, business documents, anything that might be useful. I researched lawyers who specialized in asset recovery and divorce fraud. I looked into Daniel's business partners, trying to understand who might be helping him or who might be willing to testify about his activities. And I started making a list of every person who needed to know what kind of man Daniel really was. His clients who trusted him with their money, his business partners who thought he was ethical, his family who believed he walked on water. By the time the sun began to set, I had the beginnings of a plan, not just to survive what Daniel was doing to me, but to make sure he faced consequences for every lie, every theft, every moment of betrayal. The next few days were a masterclass in deception. I had to be 2 people simultaneously. There was the Claire that Daniel saw, the trusting wife who smiled at his lies and believed his excuses. And then there was the real Claire, the one working in secret to dismantle his plans brick by brick. It was exhausting, maintaining that dual existence, but I didn't have a choice. The moment Daniel suspected I knew anything, he'd accelerate his timeline, move the remaining money, and disappear before I could stop him. I scheduled consultations with 3 different attorneys, using my lunch breaks at the hospital to meet them at coffee shops far from our neighborhood. I explained the situation, showed them the evidence I'd gathered, and asked what my options were. The first lawyer was sympathetic but pessimistic. Once money's offshore, it's very difficult to recover. You might be looking at years of litigation. The second was more aggressive, suggesting we file for an immediate restraining order on assets, but warned that could tip Daniel off before we had everything documented. The third attorney, a sharp woman named Patricia Chin, saw the situation differently. Patricia leaned back in her chair, studying me with an intensity that made me feel like she was reading my entire history. You have something most people in your situation don't have, she said. You have time and you have information he doesn't know you have. That's leverage, Jess said. We don't just stop him, we trap him. She explained that if we moved too quickly, Daniel could claim the offshore transfers were legitimate business transactions, that the money was always his, that I was a vindictive spouse making false accusations. But if we let him continue, documented every move, and then struck at exactly the right moment, we could build a case that was absolutely undeniable. Patricia became my secret weapon. She was expensive, but she agreed to work on a contingency basis, taking a percentage of whatever we recovered. She'd handled cases like mine before, wealthy men who thought they could hide assets and abandon their wives without consequences. She knew every trick, every loophole, every way to track money that was supposed to be untraceable. Together, we created a comprehensive strategy. First, we'd continue monitoring Daniel's activities without him knowing. Second, we'd secure my own finances, moving money from accounts he could access into ones he couldn't touch. Third, we'd gather witness statements from people who could corroborate his character and business practices. And finally, when the time was right, we'd strike with everything we had. I opened a new bank account at a different institution, one Daniel had no connection to. I started redirecting my paychecks there, telling the hospital payroll department I wanted to switch banks. It was a small step, but it meant that my income was now protected. I also quietly cashed out a small investment account my grandmother had left me, one that was solely in my name. It wasn't much, maybe $30,000, but it was mine, and Daniel couldn't touch it. That money became my war chest, funding Patricia's retainer and giving me a safety net for whatever came next. The hardest part was acting normal at home. Every evening, guys, I'd walk through that front door and transform into the oblivious wife. I'd ask about Daniel's day, cook dinner, watch television beside him, and sleep in the same bed, all while knowing exactly what he was planning. There were moments when I almost broke, when the weight of the deception became too much, when I wanted to scream at him and demand to know how he could do this to me. But I held on. I thought about that woman in the photos, about the life they were planning with my money, about how Daniel had laughed when he said love was never part of the plan. That anger, that cold fury, kept me focused. Patricia assigned a private investigator to tail Daniel. His name was Ron, a former police detective who specialized in financial crimes. Ron was thorough. Within a week, he'd documented multiple meetings between Daniel and Marcus, the man from the phone call. Marcus turned out to be a former colleague from Daniel's early days in finance, someone who'd been fired from a major firm for ethical violations. He was exactly the kind of person who'd help someone hide money illegally. Ron got photos of them meeting at restaurants, exchanging documents, visiting banks together. He also confirmed what I'd suspected. The woman in the photos, her name was Vanessa, and she wasn't just Daniel's mistress, she was Marcus's sister. That revelation opened up a whole new dimension to the betrayal. This wasn't just Daniel's plan, it was a family operation. Marcus was handling the financial logistics, setting up the offshore accounts and shell corporations. Vanessa was the reward waiting at the end, the new life Daniel was building while dismantling the old one. They'd probably been planning this for months, maybe even years. I wondered when it had started. Had Daniel met Vanessa before we got married, or was she a more recent development? Had he ever loved me, or was I always just a means to an end, a woman with good credit and a stable job who could help him build his business until he was ready to move on? Patricia warned me not to get lost in those questions. What matters now is protecting yourself and making sure he faces consequences. The why doesn't change what we need to say. She was right, of course, but late at night, when Daniel was asleep beside me and I was staring at the ceiling again, I couldn't help but wonder. I thought about our wedding day, how happy I'd been, how certain I was that I'd found my person. I thought about the conversations we'd had about having children, buying a bigger house, growing old together. Had any of it been real for him, or had he been calculating every step, every word, every promise? As the days passed, I started noticing things I'd missed before. The way Daniel checked his phone constantly, always angling the screen away from me. The way he'd become vague about money, brushing off my questions about our accounts with dismissive comments about having everything under control. The way he'd subtly discouraged me from being too involved in our finances, praising my hard work at the hospital while taking over all the investment decisions. He'd been grooming me for this betrayal, slowly and carefully, making me dependent on his version of reality while constructing a separate truth I wasn't allowed to see. But now I saw everything, and more importantly, I was documenting everything. Patricia had me keeping a detailed journal, noting every suspicious conversation, every time Daniel lied about where he'd been or who he'd met with. Ron was building a photographic record of Daniel's activities. We were creating a narrative, a timeline that would be impossible for Daniel to dispute once we brought it to light. And the offshore accounts? Patricia had contacts, investigators who specialized in tracking international money movements. They were following the digital trail Daniel thought he'd erased, finding the breadcrumbs that would lead us to every dollar he'd stolen. By the end of that second week, I had something I hadn't felt since that terrible night when I'd overheard Daniel's call. I had hope. Not hope that my marriage could be saved. That was dead and buried. But hope that I could emerge from this nightmare intact, that I wouldn't be left destroyed and destitute while Daniel lived happily ever after. I was building a case, brick by brick, document by document, and soon, very soon, Daniel was going to discover that the woman he'd underestimated, the woman he thought would never suspect a thing, was about to become the biggest mistake of his life. 3 weeks after I discovered Daniel's betrayal, Patricia called me with news that made my heart race. We found the main account. It's in the Cayman Islands, registered under a shell corporation. Your husband's hidden approximately $470,000 there. 470,000. That was nearly everything we'd built together, plus money from his business that I'd helped make possible. My good credit had secured the loans. My support had allowed him to take risks. My belief in him had given him the confidence to pursue opportunities. And he'd repaid me by stealing it all. Patricia wasn't done. There's more. We traced transfers from some of his clients' accounts. Small amounts, nothing that would trigger immediate red flags. But it's a pattern. He's been skimming. My stomach dropped. That's fraud. That's criminal. Patricia's voice was steady. Yes, which means this isn't just a divorce case anymore. If we wanted to, we could bring criminal charges. He could face prison time. The weight of that statement settled over me. I'd been so focused on recovering my money and exposing Daniel's betrayal that I hadn't fully considered how deep his crimes might go. He wasn't just a cheating husband, he was a criminal, someone who'd been stealing from vulnerable people who trusted him with their life savings. I thought about Daniel's clients, people I'd met at company events over the years, retirees planning their golden years, young families saving for their children's education, widows trying to make their late husband's insurance money last. Daniel had looked them in the eye, shaken their hands, promised to protect their financial futures, and then stolen from them. The betrayal of our marriage suddenly seemed like just one piece of a much larger pattern of deception. Patricia asked me what I wanted to do. We can pursue civil remedies, recover your assets, and let him walk away from the rest. Or we can go nuclear, expose everything, bring in the authorities, destroy him completely. I didn't answer immediately. This was a line once crossed that couldn't be uncrossed. If I brought criminal charges, Daniel's life would be over. His career, his reputation, his freedom, everything. Part of me, the part that had loved him for 8 years, hesitated. But then I thought about those clients. I thought about the elderly couple who'd trusted Daniel with their retirement funds. I thought about the young mother who'd been saving for her daughter's college education. They deserved justice too. This wasn't just about me anymore. Daniel had hurt so many people, and if I stayed silent, he'd keep doing it. He'd move to the Cayman Islands with Vanessa, start over with a new name and a new scheme, and ruin more lives. I want to go nuclear, I told Patricia. Everything, civil and criminal. I want him to face every consequence for what he's done. I could hear the smile in her voice. Then let's make sure we do this right. We need to time this perfectly. He's planning to make his final transfer soon, probably within the next week, based on the patterns Ron's documented. Once he does that, once he thinks all the money is secure and untraceable, that's when we strike. We'll have him on completed fraud, not just attempted. The evidence will be undeniable, and we'll catch him before he has a chance to run. The next few days were agonizing. I knew the end was coming, but I had to maintain the charade just a little longer. Daniel was getting more confident, more relaxed. He'd started making subtle comments about our future, talking about maybe taking a trip, just the two of us, to reconnect. I realized he was setting up his exit story, creating a narrative where he'd suggest a vacation and then never come back, leaving me abandoned in some resort while he disappeared to the Cayman Islands. The calculated cruelty of it took my breath away. Ron called me at work one afternoon, his voice urgent. He's on the move, meeting with Marcus at First National Bank downtown. This might be it. I told my supervisor I had a family emergency and left the hospital. Patricia met me at a coffee shop 2 blocks from the bank, her laptop open, tracking the activity in Daniel's accounts in real time through her investigator contacts. We watched as large transfers initiated, money moving from various accounts into the Cayman Shell Corporation. He's consolidating everything, Patricia murmured. This is the final push. Once this clears, he'll think he's home free. My phone buzzed. A text from Daniel. Working late tonight. Don't wait up. I showed it to Patricia. She nodded. He's not working late. He's probably celebrating with Marcus and Vanessa, thinking he's pulled off the perfect crime. I felt a surge of savage satisfaction. Let him celebrate. Let him think he's won. The fall would be so much harder from that height. Patricia made several calls, speaking in clipped, professional tones. She was coordinating with the authorities, with the Financial Crimes Unit, with the regulatory board that oversaw financial advisors. Everything was in motion now, a machine we'd built over the past 3 weeks that was finally roaring to life. That evening, I went home to our empty house. Daniel's text had said, not to wait up, but I knew he wouldn't be back until very late. He was probably at Vanessa's apartment, toasting his brilliant scheme, kit, maybe even showing her the account balances that represented his escape. I walked through the rooms of our home, seeing everything differently now. The furniture we'd picked out together felt like props in a stage play. The photos on the walls showed a couple that had never really existed. This house wasn't a home. It was a crime scene, the place where my old life had been destroyed. I packed a bag, not everything, just enough for a few days. Clothes, toiletries, important documents, items with sentimental value that I didn't want Daniel to have access to. I loaded my car in the darkness, Max watching me curiously from the front door. I knelt down and hugged him, burying my face in his fur one more time. I'd arranged for my sister to pick him up tomorrow. Daniel might try to use Max as leverage, and I couldn't let that happen. Max deserved better than to be a pawn in this war. I'm sorry, boy, I whispered. Things are going to get really complicated really fast. But I'll come back for you. I promise. I drove to a hotel across town, one of those extended stay places where nobody asks questions. Patricia had suggested I make myself scarce for the next 24 hours, let Daniel think I was still completely in the dark while everything came crashing down around him. I checked in under my maiden name, paid cash, and locked myself in a bland room that smelled faintly of cleaning products and other people's lives. I couldn't sleep. I lay on the stiff hotel bed, fully clothed, phone in hand, waiting for the call that would tell me it had started. The call that would signal the beginning of Daniel's end and, hopefully, the beginning of my ability to rebuild. At 2 in the morning, my phone finally rang. Patricia's voice was electric with barely contained excitement. It's done. The authorities executed a freeze on all his accounts, including the offshore ones. He can't move a single dollar. They've also seized his business records and issued a warrant for his arrest. By tomorrow morning, every client will be notified, every business partner will know, and Daniel will be facing multiple counts of fraud, embezzlement, and theft. I closed my eyes, feeling something between relief and grief wash over me. It's really happening. It's really over. Not quite over, Patricia corrected. This is just the beginning of the legal process. But the important part, he can't hurt you anymore. He can't take anything else from you. And tomorrow, when he wakes up expecting to finalize his escape, he's going to find out that the walls have closed in and there's nowhere left to run. I thanked her, ended the call, and finally let myself cry. Not sad tears, not really. They were more complicated than that. Tears for the life I'd thought I had. Tears for the trust I'd placed in someone who'd never deserved it. Tears for the woman I'd been 3 weeks ago who'd walked into her home feeling secure and had her entire world shattered by a conversation she wasn't supposed to hear. But beneath the tears, there was something hard and bright and unbreakable. I had survived. I had fought back. And tomorrow, Daniel would learn what it felt like to have your life destroyed by someone you'd underestimated. Tomorrow, justice would start to look like something real. I didn't hear from Daniel until noon the next day. By then, I knew the morning had been catastrophic for him. Patricia had been feeding me updates via text. At 7 a.m., federal agents had shown up at his office with a warrant. At 8, his assets were formally frozen. By 9, several of his largest clients had filed complaints with the regulatory board. At 10, the local news picked up the story. Prominent financial advisor arrested for fraud. By 11, his mugshot was online, his expression stunned and furious, like he couldn't comprehend how this was happening. When he finally called, I almost didn't answer. My hand hovered over the phone, his name flashing on the screen, and I felt a moment of pure vertigo. This was it, the moment where I'd hear his voice knowing that he knew everything had collapsed. I answered, "Claire." His voice was ragged, desperate. "Claire, where are you? I need you. There's been a terrible mistake." I kept my voice steady, cold. "There's no mistake, Daniel. I know everything." The line went silent for so long I thought he'd hung up. Then, quietly, "What are you talking about?" I almost laughed at the attempt to maintain the lie. "I heard you, Daniel. 3 weeks ago. I heard your phone call. I heard you planning to take everything and disappear. I've known this entire time." Another long silence. Then his voice changed, became harder. "You've been spying on me? You went through my things." The indignation would have been funny if it weren't so pathetic. "You stole from me. You stole from your clients. You committed fraud. And you're angry that I went through your things?" He started to speak, to formulate some excuse or justification, but I cut him off. "Don't. Just don't. I'm not the naive wife you thought I was. I have evidence of everything, every transfer, every lie, every crime, and I gave it all to the authorities." I could hear him breathing, ragged and uneven. "You destroyed me." The words should have brought me satisfaction, but instead they just made me tired. "No, Daniel, you destroyed yourself. I just made sure you faced consequences." He tried a different approach, his voice softening, becoming the man I used to know. "Claire, please, we can fix this. I made mistakes, but we can work through this. I love you." Those 3 words, words that used to make my heart soar, now meant nothing. "You don't love me. You never did. I was a tool, a means to an end. And when you were done with me, you were going to discard me and move on to Vanessa." The mention of her name made him go silent again. I continued, "I know about her, Daniel. I know about Marcus. I know about the Cayman Islands. I know about every single part of your plan, and now everyone else knows too. Your clients, your partners, your family, everyone." His voice, when it came back, was venomous. "You had no right. You've ruined my life." I felt that cold anger surge again. "You ruined your own life, and you tried to ruin mine. But here's the difference between us. I'm going to rebuild. I'm going to recover. You? You're going to prison." He hung up. I stood in that hotel room, phone still pressed to my ear, listening to the empty silence, and I felt something I hadn't expected. Peace, not happiness, not yet, but a sense that I'd done what needed to be done, that I'd stood up for myself in a way I never had before. Daniel had thought I'd be easy to manipulate, easy to betray, easy to discard. He'd been wrong about all of it. The woman he'd married might have been those things, but the woman I'd become, she was something else entirely. Over the next few weeks, the legal process ground forward. Daniel was charged with multiple counts of wire fraud, embezzlement, and theft. The evidence Patricia and I had gathered made prosecution straightforward. He tried to fight, hired an expensive lawyer with money he didn't actually have anymore, but it was hopeless. The paper trail was too clear. The testimony from his clients was too damning. Marcus was arrested too, charged as an accessory. They'd both likely face significant prison time. Vanessa disappeared, presumably realizing that her meal ticket was going to jail and wanting nothing to do with the fallout. Patricia worked on recovering the assets. The offshore accounts were frozen, and while it would take time to fully untangle the web of shell corporations Daniel had created, she was confident we'd recover most of the money. Some of it would go back to his defrauded clients. The rest would come to me, compensation for the years I'd invested in a marriage built on lies. I filed for divorce, citing fraud and abandonment. Daniel didn't contest it. He was too busy trying to stay out of prison, though that fight was clearly lost. I moved out of our house and into a small apartment closer to the hospital. I took Max with me, and he adjusted quickly, seeming happier in a space that didn't carry the weight of betrayal. My sister and my close friends rallied around me, offering support I hadn't realized I needed. They'd all loved Daniel, believed in our marriage, and learning the truth was almost as shocking for them as it had been for me. But they never wavered. They stood by me, helped me pack, helped me move, helped me begin the slow process of healing. The hardest part wasn't the legal battle or the practical considerations of rebuilding my life. It was the emotional aftermath. I'd wake up in the middle of the night, heart racing, replaying moments from my marriage and wondering how I'd missed the signs. I'd see couples on the street holding hands and laughing and feel a stab of something between envy and grief. I'd think about the future I'd imagined, the children I'd wanted, the life I'd planned, and have to remind myself that it had never been real. Daniel had never wanted those things. He just wanted what I could provide until he didn't need me anymore. But slowly, day by day, I started to feel like myself again, not the old Claire, the one who'd been so trusting and naive. That woman was gone. But a new version, someone stronger, someone who'd looked at the worst betrayal imaginable and not only survived, but fought back. I started seeing a therapist, working through the trauma and the trust issues that Daniel had created. I joined a support group for people who'd been defrauded by their spouses. Hearing other people's stories, realizing I wasn't alone in this experience, helped more than I had expected. 6 months after that terrible night when I had overheard Daniel's phone call, I stood in a courtroom and watched him be sentenced. 5 years in federal prison for fraud and embezzlement. The judge's words were harsh, condemning Daniel's betrayal of his client's trust and his systematic theft. Daniel stood there in an orange jumpsuit, shoulders slumped, looking nothing like the confident man who'd once charmed everyone he met. Our eyes met briefly across the courtroom. I don't know what he saw in my face. I hope he saw strength. I hope he saw someone who'd refused to be a victim. I hope he understood finally that underestimating me was the biggest mistake he'd ever made. After the sentencing, Patricia and I went for coffee. Most of the money had been recovered by then, and she'd done an incredible job of ensuring I got what was rightfully mine. You did good, she told me, stirring sugar into her espresso. A lot of people in your situation would have just walked away, tried to move on and forget. But you stood up, you fought, you made sure he faced consequences, not just for you, but for everyone he hurt. I nodded, thinking about those clients and the people who'd trusted Daniel with their futures. They'd gotten their money back too. The regulatory board had stepped in, provided restitution. It wasn't just my victory, it was everyone's. I went back to work at the hospital, throwing myself into helping others. There was something cleansing about focusing on patients, on people who needed me, on problems I could actually solve. My colleagues knew what had happened. It had been in the news, but they were respectful, giving me space when I needed it and support when I'd asked. I realized that my work, my ability to help people in crisis, had prepared me for my own crisis in ways I hadn't recognized. I knew how to stay calm under pressure. I knew how to assess situations and make strategic decisions. I knew how to fight for what mattered. And slowly, very slowly, I started to think about the future again, not the future I'd imagined with Daniel that was dead and buried where it belonged, but a new future, one where I was whole on my own. one where I didn't need someone else to feel complete, one where I could trust myself, trust my judgment, and build a life that was genuinely mine. It wouldn't be easy. The scars from Daniel's betrayal would probably never fully heal, but I was learning to live with them, to see them not as weaknesses, but as evidence of what I'd survived. A year after everything fell apart, I did something I never thought I'd do again. I smiled at a man who smiled back. His name was Thomas, a pediatrician at the hospital where I worked. We'd been colleagues for years, exchanged professional pleasantries, collaborated on patient care. But I'd been married, off limits, and he'd been respectful of that. After my divorce, he'd given me space, never pushing, just being consistently kind. One day in the hospital cafeteria, he asked if I wanted company for lunch. I almost said no. The idea of opening up to anyone, even in the smallest way, terrified me, but I said yes. And we talked, not about my past or his, just about work, about a particularly difficult case we'd both been involved in, about the weather and books and the small things that make up a normal conversation. It felt strange sitting across from someone without walls between us, without hidden agendas lurking beneath every word. Thomas didn't know all the details of what had happened with Daniel. He knew the basics, everyone at the hospital did, but he didn't pry. He didn't treat me like broken glass that might shatter at any moment. He just treated me like a person, like Claire. We started having lunch together regularly, then coffee, then, eventually, dinner outside of work. I was terrified the entire time, waiting for the other shoe to drop, for some sign that Thomas wasn't who he seemed to be. My therapist told me this was normal, that after what Daniel had done, trusting anyone would take time. But Thomas was patient. When I had moments of panic, when I'd pull back or become distant, he didn't push. He just waited. And slowly, painfully slowly, I started to believe that maybe not everyone was like Daniel. Maybe betrayal wasn't inevitable. Maybe I could risk opening my heart again. We took things incredibly slowly. Thomas seemed to understand without being told that I needed time, needed to rebuild trust at my own pace. We'd been seeing each other for 6 months before he even kissed me. And even then, he asked permission first. Is this okay? Those 3 words, the acknowledgement that my consent mattered, that my comfort was important, nearly made me cry. Yes, I'd whispered, it's okay. And it was. It was more than okay. It was the first time in years I'd felt something real, something not built on lies and manipulation. It was the first time I'd felt hope for a romantic future. But healing wasn't just about finding someone new. It was about rediscovering who I was without Daniel's shadow hanging over me. I took up painting, something I'd loved in college, but had abandoned during my marriage. Daniel had always dismissed it as a waste of time, suggesting I focus on more practical pursuits. Now, in my small apartment, I set up an easel by the window and lost myself in colors and brushstrokes. I wasn't good, not really, but that wasn't the point. It was mine. An expression of something inside me that had nothing to do with anyone else's expectations or judgments. I also became involved in advocacy work. Patricia introduced me to an organization that helped people who'd been financially abused by their partners. I started volunteering, sharing my story, helping others navigate the legal system and find the resources they needed. It was hard hearing stories that echoed my own, seeing the pain and betrayal in other people's eyes. But it was also healing. Every person I helped felt like a small victory against the Daniels of the world, against the predators who thought they could use and discard people without consequences. One woman I helped, Jennifer, had been married for 15 years when she discovered her husband had taken out credit cards in her name, destroyed her credit, and disappeared with another woman. She'd come to the support group broken, convinced her life was over. I sat with her, listened to her story, and then shared mine. I told her about that night I'd overheard Daniel's phone call about the fear and devastation, about how I'd fought back, and I told her that she could fight back too, that she wasn't helpless, that there were ways to recover and rebuild. 6 months later, Jennifer sent me a photo of herself smiling in front of a new apartment. She'd gotten a fresh start, restored her credit, and was pursuing the nursing degree she'd always wanted. Thank you for showing me it was possible, she wrote. You gave me hope when I had none. That's what I'd become. Someone who gave hope, someone who'd survived something terrible and came out stronger. It wasn't the identity I'd chosen. I'd have preferred to never go through what Daniel put me through, but it was meaningful. And in an odd way, I was grateful for it. Not grateful for the betrayal, but grateful for who I'd become in response to it. The old Claire, the one who'd walked into her house that terrible evening, would never have believed she could be this strong. She'd have crumbled, even given up, let someone else rescue her. The new Claire had rescued herself. Daniel was in prison, and I never visited him. I never wrote him letters. I never attempted any kind of reconciliation or closure. Some people in my support group sought that, needed to hear apologies or explanations from their ex-partners. I didn't. Everything I needed to know about Daniel, I'd learned in those weeks after I discovered his betrayal. He was a man who valued money and status over people. He was someone who could look me in the eye and lie without hesitation. He was capable of destroying lives without remorse. What else was there to understand? What apology could possibly matter? Marcus got 4 years. I heard through Patricia that he was in a different facility than Daniel, that the two of them had turned on each other during prosecution, each trying to minimize their own culpability by blaming the other. Vanessa had never been charged. Technically, she hadn't done anything illegal, just benefited from Daniel's crimes. I heard she'd moved to another state, started over somewhere far from the mess her brother and boyfriend had created. I hoped she'd learned something from the experience, though I doubted it. People like that rarely did. The house Daniel and I had shared was sold, the proceeds divided as part of the divorce settlement. I got the majority since I'd contributed most of the down payment from my inheritance, and because Daniel had committed fraud with our joint assets. I used some of the money to pay off my student loans from nursing school. The rest went into a savings account, a foundation for whatever future I decided to build. I didn't need a fancy house or expensive things. I needed security. I needed to know that I could take care of myself, that I'd never be dependent on someone else's honesty or goodwill again. My relationship with Thomas deepened, but I was careful. I'd learned the hard way that trust needed to be earned slowly, demonstrated through actions over time. Thomas never pressured me for more than I was ready to give. When I had bad days, when the trauma would resurface and I'd become distant or anxious, he'd simply say, "I'm here, whatever you need." And he'd mean it. He didn't make grand promises about forever. He didn't try to rush me into commitments I wasn't ready for. He just showed up, consistently and honestly, letting his actions speak louder than words ever could. On the second anniversary of the night I'd overheard Daniel's phone call, I did something symbolic. I gathered all the remaining photos from my marriage, the ones I'd kept in a box, unable to throw away but also unable to look at, and I burned them. Thomas was with me, standing beside a fire pit in his backyard, watching as flames consumed images of a life that had never been real. As the last photo curled and blackened, I felt something release inside me. Not forgiveness for Daniel, he didn't deserve that, but a letting go of the pain he'd caused. I'd carried it long enough. It was time to set it down. "I'm free," I said to Thomas, watching smoke rise into the night sky. He took my hand, squeezed gently. "You've always been free. You just needed to realize it." And he was right. Daniel had tried to trap me, to take everything and leave me destroyed. But I'd broken free, I'd fought back, I'd survived. And now I was more than surviving. I was living, really, truly living in a way I never had before, not because of Thomas or my work or any external factor, but because I'd discovered something unbreakable inside myself, a core of strength I hadn't known existed, and nothing and no one could take that away from me ever again. 3 years after Daniel went to prison, I received an unexpected letter. It was from him, forwarded through Patricia's office to avoid him having my direct address. For a long moment, I just stared at the envelope, his handwriting familiar and strange all at once. My first instinct was to throw it away unopened. What could he possibly have to say that I'd want to hear? But curiosity won. I sat down at my kitchen table, Max at my feet, and carefully opened the letter. The words were what I'd expected, and yet still somehow surprising. Daniel apologized. Pages and pages of apologies, explaining that he'd had time to reflect, that he understood how badly he'd hurt me, that he regretted his choices. He talked about therapy he'd been receiving in prison, about coming to terms with the person he'd been and wanting to become someone better. He said he didn't expect forgiveness, didn't deserve it, but wanted me to know that he carried genuine remorse for what he'd done. The letter ended with a simple statement: "You deserved so much better than what I gave you. I hope you found happiness. I truly do." I read the letter 3 times, searching for manipulation or hidden agendas, but it seemed genuine. Daniel was facing the consequences of his actions and maybe, finally, understanding the magnitude of what he'd done. Part of me felt a small measure of satisfaction in that, but mostly I just felt nothing. No anger, no grief, no lingering pain. He'd become a character in a story I'd moved past, someone who'd once had the power to destroy me but no longer mattered. I folded the letter, put it back in the envelope, and filed it away in a drawer. Not as a keepsake, but as evidence of how far I'd come. The woman who'd received this letter wasn't the woman he'd betrayed. She was someone entirely new. Thomas and I had been together for over 2 years by then, and our relationship had become the healthiest thing in my life. We'd moved in together, a decision I'd agonized over for months before finally taking the leap. Living with someone again, sharing space and vulnerability, terrified me. But Thomas made it easy. He respected my boundaries, gave me space when I needed it, and created an environment where I felt safe. We talked about everything: our pasts, our fears, our hopes for the future. The transparency was sometimes uncomfortable, but it was also healing. No secrets, no hidden agendas, just two people trying to build something real together. We got engaged on a quiet evening with no fanfares. Thomas didn't make a grand production of it. He simply said, "I want to spend my life with you, if you'll have me. I love who you are, who you've become, and who you're still becoming." And he held out a simple ring, beautiful in its lack of pretension. I said yes, not because I needed marriage to feel complete, but because I wanted to build a life with this man who'd shown me what real love looked like. Love that didn't manipulate or betray. Love that was steady and honest and safe. Planning the wedding was different than it had been with Daniel. The first time I'd been swept up in the fairy tale, the big venue, the elaborate ceremony, the feeling of being a princess for a day. This time, I wanted something small and meaningful. We got married in a garden with just our closest friends and family. My sister was my maid of honor. Thomas's brother was his best man. The ceremony was brief and heartfelt, focused on the promises we were making to each other. And when I said I do, I meant it in a way I never had before. This was real. This was chosen. This was built on a foundation of truth instead of lies. My work at the hospital had become more than just a job. I'd been promoted to a senior position, mentoring younger nurses and helping shape patient care protocols. I'd also expanded my advocacy work, speaking at conferences about financial abuse and helping to develop resources for victims. I'd written several articles for professional journals about the intersection of emotional trauma and physical health, drawing on my own experience to inform my understanding of how betrayal affects the body and mind. My pain had become purposeful. The worst thing that had ever happened to me had been transformed into a tool for helping others. One day I was invited to speak at a university about my journey. The auditorium was full of students studying psychology, social work, and law. I stood at that podium and told my story, not with shame or embarrassment, but with clarity and strength. I talked about how I'd discovered the betrayal, how I'd felt, how I'd fought back. I talked about the importance of documentation, of seeking professional help, of not suffering in silence. And I talked about the possibility of rebuilding, of finding yourself again after someone tries to destroy you. During the Q&A session, a young woman raised her hand. "How did you know you could trust again? How did you let someone else in after what happened?" The question hung in the air, and I saw my younger self in her eyes. I took a breath and answered honestly. I didn't know. I was terrified. But I realized that Daniel didn't get to take my capacity for love away from me. That was mine, and I could choose what to do with it. I chose to risk it again, carefully and slowly, with someone who proved through actions, not just words, that he was trustworthy. And even if it hadn't worked out, even if I'd been hurt again, it would still have been worth trying, because living in fear isn't living, it's just existing. The applause that followed told me I'd said something that resonated. After the event, several people approached me with their own stories of betrayal and survival. A middle aged man whose business partner had stolen from him, a young woman whose best friend had sabotaged her career, an elderly couple who'd been defrauded by their financial advisor, just like Daniel's clients. Each of them thanked me for sharing, for showing them that recovery was possible, and I realized that this was my purpose now. Not just nursing, not just advocacy, but being living proof that betrayal doesn't have to be the end of your story. It can be the beginning of something stronger. Daniel was eventually released from prison after serving the most of his sentence. I heard about it through the grapevine, but felt nothing. He'd become irrelevant to my life, a footnote in a chapter I'd closed long ago. I hoped he'd learned something, hoped he'd become better, but I didn't need to know. His journey was no longer my concern. I had my own path, my own life, my own happiness to focus on. Patricia had long since moved on to other cases, but we stayed in touch. She'd become more than just my lawyer. She was a friend, someone who'd stood beside me during the darkest period of my life and helped me find light again. Thomas and I talked about having children. It was a conversation that brought up complicated feelings. I'd wanted children with Daniel, had imagined building a family with him. That dream had been destroyed along with my marriage. But now, with Thomas, I could think about it again, not as replacing what I'd lost, but as creating something new. We decided to wait, to strengthen our foundation first, but the possibility was there. The future was open and full of potential in a way it hadn't been for years. On what would have been my 10th wedding anniversary with Daniel, I did something deliberately symbolic. Thomas and I went back to the garden where we'd gotten married and planted a tree. It was a Japanese maple, beautiful and resilient, something that would grow and change over the years. As we patted soil around its roots, I thought about growth, about how trauma can either destroy you or become fertilizer for something beautiful, about how the worst moments of our lives can, if we let them, teach us the most important lessons, about how strength isn't about never being hurt, but about getting up after being knocked down and choosing to keep going. I looked at Thomas, at this man who'd shown me what love should be, and felt a wave of gratitude so powerful it almost brought me to tears. Then I looked at the young tree we'd just planted, fragile but alive, and saw it as a metaphor for everything I'd rebuilt. My life, my trust, my hope. Daniel had tried to uproot all of that, to leave me barren and destroyed, but I'd survived, more than survived. I'd flourished, and this tree, growing in soil nourished by both darkness and light, would stand as a testament to that. As we walked away from the garden, Thomas's hand in mine, Max trotting beside us, I felt something I hadn't felt in years, complete, genuine happiness. Not the naive happiness of my first marriage, built on illusions and false promises, but a deeper, more resilient happiness, the kind that knows darkness exists but chooses light anyway, the kind that's been tested and proven strong, the kind that doesn't fear the future because it trusts in its own ability to face whatever comes. I'd walked into my house that terrible evening 3 years ago feeling secure, but built on lies. Now I walk through life actually secure, built on truth. And that made all the difference. If there's one thing my story teaches is this: trust yourself. When something feels wrong, when your instincts are screaming at you even though you can't articulate why, listen to that voice. I'd ignored small warning signs for months, dismissing my unease as paranoia or insecurity. But deep down, some part of me had known. Some part of me had seen the truth I didn't want to face. If I'd acted on those instincts earlier, I might have saved myself some pain. But I also might not have learned what I was truly capable of. Betrayal is devastating. There's no way around that truth. When someone you love and trust destroys that trust, it shakes your foundation. It makes you question everything you thought you knew about yourself, about relationships, about the world. But here's what I learned: you are stronger than you know. You have reserves of courage and resilience you haven't tapped into yet. When crisis comes, and it comes for everyone eventually, you'll discover capabilities you didn't know you possessed. The key is not letting the betrayal define you. Let it refine you instead. Document everything. This is practical advice that I cannot stress enough. If you ever find yourself in a situation like mine, where someone is lying to you, stealing from you, or planning to hurt you, document everything. Screenshots, photos, written notes with dates and times. Evidence is power. It's the difference between being a helpless victim and being someone who can fight back effectively. I was able to build a case against Daniel because I methodically gathered proof of his crimes. Without that evidence, it would have been my word against his, and the outcome might have been very different. Don't suffer in silence, reach out for help. I was lucky to find Patricia, a skilled attorney who understood what I was facing, but I also leaned on friends, family, therapists, and support groups. There's no shame in needing help. In fact, recognizing when you need support and actively seeking it out is one of the strongest things you can do. Isolation is what allows abusers and betrayers to maintain control. Connection and community are how you break free. Tell people what's happening, let them support you. You don't have to face darkness alone. And finally, know this: recovery is possible, happiness is possible, love is possible again. I know it doesn't feel that way in the immediate aftermath of betrayal. I know it feels like your life is over, like you'll never trust anyone again, like the pain will never end. But time, combined with deliberate effort toward healing, does work. You won't forget what happened. The scars will always be there, but they'll fade, become part of your history rather than your present. And one day you'll realize you're not just surviving anymore, you're living, really, truly living. And the person who betrayed you no longer has any power over your joy. My journey from that terrible night to where I am now wasn't easy. There were setbacks and dark days and moments when I wanted to give up, but I didn't. I kept going. I fought for myself in a way I'd never had to before, and in doing so, I discovered who I really was beneath all the roles and expectations I'd been performing. I found Claire, the real one, strong, capable, resilient, and worthy of genuine love. Daniel tried to take everything from me, but he couldn't take that, and neither can anyone else. That belongs to me and always will. So if you're reading this and you've experienced betrayal, if you feel broken and lost and unsure how to move forward, please hear me. You can survive this. You can rebuild. You can find happiness again. It won't be the same happiness you had before. It'll be better, deeper, more real, because it'll be built on truth instead of lies, on strength instead of illusion. Your story isn't over. This is just a chapter, a painful, terrible chapter, but still just one part of a much larger narrative. And you get to write what comes next. Make it beautiful, make it true, make it yours.